You know that uneasy feeling you get when something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? Like when you walk into a room and sense the conversation just stopped? That's the feeling a lot of economists are getting right now when they look at the American economy. On the surface, everything looks fine. The stock market is still hovering near all-time highs. Unemployment numbers look decent. Your local coffee shop is still packed every morning. But underneath, there are cracks forming. And they're not small cracks. They're the kind of structural fractures that preceded every major recession in modern history. I'm Brad, and I spend an unhealthy amount of time analyzing economic data, market patterns, and the indicators that most people ignore until it's too late. If you're someone who wants to understand what's really happening in the economy beyond the headline numbers, and more importantly, how to protect yourself from what's coming, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Because today, we're not talking about theories or predictions. We're talking about 5 concrete, measurable signs that a recession is no longer a question of if, it's a question of when, and answer might be sooner than anyone wants to admit. Sign number 1. The yield curve has been screaming for 18 months. Let's start with the most reliable recession predictor in modern economic history, the inverted yield curve. Now, I know your eyes might be glazing over already because yield curve sounds like boring financial jargon. But stay with me because this is critically important. Here's what you need to understand. Normally, when you lend money to the government by buying a treasury bond, you get paid more interest for longer-term bonds than shorter-term ones. That makes intuitive sense, right? If I'm going to lock up my money for 10 years instead of 2 years, I should get paid more for taking that risk. But something weird has been happening since late 2022. The yield curve. Inverted meaning short-term bonds started paying more than long-term bonds. This is abnormal. This is your economy's check engine light. And here's the terrifying part. An inverted yield curve has predicted every single recession since 1969 with only one false signal. When this happens, a recession follows within 6 to 24 months. We're now 18 months into this inversion. We're in the danger zone. But Brad, you might say, the yield curve uninverted recently? Doesn't that mean we're safe? Actually, no. And this is the part that should really worry you. Historically, the recession doesn't hit while the curve is inverted. It hits right after it uninverts. When the curve steepens again as the Fed starts cutting rates in panic mode, we're watching that happen right now in real time. The Fed has signaled they're preparing to cut rates. The curve is steepening. This isn't the all-clear signal. This is the starting gun. Sign number 2, commercial real estate is quietly imploding. While everyone's been focused on residential housing prices, something catastrophic has been happening in commercial real estate that almost nobody is talking about. Office buildings in major cities are sitting at 30 to 40% vacancy rates. And we're not talking about temporary pandemic-related vacancies anymore. We're talking about permanent structural changes to how people work. Companies have realized they don't need massive office spaces when half their workforce is remote. Leases are expiring, and they're not being renewed. Buildings that were valued at $200 million 3 years ago are now worth $80 million. Some are worth even less. Here's why this matters to you. Even if you don't own commercial property, these buildings were purchased with massive loans from regional banks. When a $200 million building is suddenly worth $80 million, the loan backing that property is underwater. The bank has a problem, and it's not just one building. It's thousands of buildings across every major city in America. According to recent analysis, there's approximately $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate loans that need to be refinanced between now and 2026. Many of these properties can't support the debt they're carrying at current valuations and current interest rates. This is a ticking time bomb sitting on bank balance sheets, and we've already seen the first explosions. Remember Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, First Republic? Those weren't isolated incidents. They were warning shots. The commercial real estate crisis hasn't fully materialized yet because banks have been able to extend and pretend, pushing out loan maturities and avoiding marking properties to their true market value. But you can only pretend for so long. When these loans start defaulting in earnest, and they will, we are looking at a banking crisis that could make 2008 look like a warm-up. Sign number 3, consumer debt has hit genuinely insane levels. Let's talk about the American consumer, because the entire US economy is built on one assumption. Americans will keep spending money they don't have. And boy, have we been living up to that assumption. As of early 2026, total household debt in America has surpassed $17.5 trillion. Credit card debt alone has crossed $1.1 trillion, an all-time record. Auto loan debt is over $1.6 trillion. Student loan debt is still sitting above $1.7 trillion, despite forgiveness programs. But here's what makes this different from previous debt bubbles. The interest rates. When Americans were racking up debt in 2020 and 2021, interest rates were basically zero. People were getting credit cards with 0% introductory APRs for 18 months, car loans at 2.9%, mortgages at 3%. Those days are gone. The average credit card APR is now over 24%. Auto loans are averaging 7 to 8% for people with good credit and much higher for subprime borrowers. Those introductory 0% rates have expired, and people are now paying the full freight on debt they accumulated when money was cheap. This creates a debt service burden that's unsustainable. More and more of people's income is going just to pay interest on existing debt, leaving less for actual consumption. And we're already seeing this show up in the data. Credit card delinquencies are rising at the fastest pace since 2009. Auto loan delinquencies are at levels we haven't seen since the financial crisis. By now, pay later services, which exploded during the pandemic, are seeing default rates that are genuinely alarming. The American consumer is tapped out. And when the consumer stops spending in an economy where consumer spending represents 70% of GDP, you know what happens next. Sign number 4. Corporate layoffs are accelerating, but companies are hiding it. Here's something that should be setting off alarm bells, but isn't getting nearly enough attention. Major corporations have been quietly laying off workers for months, but they're being very strategic about how they announce it to avoid spooking the market. Instead of big, headline-grabbing mass layoffs like we saw in 2008, companies are doing stealth layoffs, cutting 3% here, 5% there, calling them organizational restructuring or efficiency improvements or strategic real. Tech companies have laid off over 150,000 workers in the past 18 months. Finance companies are cutting back office staff. Retailers are reducing headcount. Manufacturing is contracting. But each individual announcement is small enough that it doesn't make major news. It's death by 1,000 cuts instead of one dramatic blow. Why does this matter? Because historically, when corporations start cutting staff, it's because they see something coming. These companies have access to real-time sales data, customer behavior metrics, and forward-looking indicators that the general public doesn't see. When Apple starts laying off workers, it's not because they suddenly decided to be more efficient. It's because they're seeing iPhone sales projections that aren't hitting targets. When Goldman Sachs cuts staff, it's because they're seeing deal flow dry up. When Amazon reduces headcount, it's because consumer spending data is softening. Corporate executives are like rats on a ship. When they start abandoning positions, it's because they smell smoke. And there's another dimension to this that's even more concerning. Productivity gains from AI. Companies are realizing they can replace workers with AI tools and automation faster than anyone anticipated. This isn't just about efficiency, this is about fundamentally restructuring how much human labor is needed. We're entering a period where productivity might go up while employment goes down. That's a recipe for a recession with very slow recovery. Because even when the economy starts growing again, those jobs won't come back. Sign number 5. The savings rate has collapsed and pandemic cushions are gone. During the pandemic, Americans did something unusual. They saved money. Between stimulus checks, reduced spending opportunities, and student loan payment pauses, the personal savings rate shot up to levels we hadn't seen in decades. That created a cushion even as inflation ate away at purchasing power in 2022 and 2023. Many households had enough saved to absorb the shock. But that cushion is gone now. The personal savings rate has collapsed back down to around 3.5%, well below the historical average of 7 to 8%. This means Americans are saving almost nothing from their current income. They're living paycheck to paycheck again, but this time with higher debt loads and higher interest rates. Even more concerning, excess savings, the extra money accumulated during the pandemic, has been completely depleted for the bottom 80% of income earners. Only the top 20% still have pandemic savings left, and even those are dwindling. This matters because savings are what allow people to weather economic storms. When you have 6 months of expenses saved, you can handle a job loss without immediately defaulting on your obligations. When you have zero savings, any disruption becomes catastrophic. And we're seeing this play out in real time. The number of people living paycheck to paycheck has climbed back to pre-pandemic levels, roughly 60% of Americans, but now they're doing it with higher expenses, higher debt payments, and no cushion. When the next shock hits, whether it's mass layoffs, a stock market correction, or another crisis, there's no buffer. Defaults will cascade immediately. The perfect storm. Here's what makes 2026 particularly dangerous. These 5 signs aren't happening in isolation. They're all happening simultaneously, and they're interconnected. The inverted yield curve signals that financial conditions are tight, which accelerates commercial real estate problems, which threatens banks, which makes them pull back on lending, which forces consumers to rely more on expensive credit card debt, which becomes unsustainable, which forces companies to cut costs through layoffs, which reduces consumer spending, which hurts corporate revenues, which leads to more layoffs. It's a feedback loop, and once it starts spinning, it's very hard to stop. The Federal Reserve's toolkit is also limited this time. Normally, when a recession hits, the Fed cuts interest rates aggressively to stimulate the economy, but they're starting from a much lower baseline than usual. Even if they cut rates by 2 to 3%, we'd still be at interest rate levels that are restrictive by historical standards. And they can't cut too aggressively because inflation, while improved from its 2022 peak, is still above their 2% target. If they cut rates too much too fast, they risk reigniting inflation, which would force them to raise rates again, which would make everything worse. They're trapped between inflation and recession, and there's no clear path out. What this means for you? So what do you do with this information? First, understand that this isn't about panic. This is about preparation. If you've got high interest debt, particularly credit card debt, make paying that down your absolute top priority. In a recession, that debt becomes an anchor that will drag you under. Build your emergency fund if you haven't already. If you have one, consider building it even larger than the traditional 3 to 6 months of expenses. In a recession, with a slow recovery, 9 to 12 months of expenses is better. If you're employed, now is the time to make yourself indispensable at work. Document your value, take on high visibility projects, build relationships with decision makers. Don't be the person who's easy to cut when layoffs come. If you're investing, understand that we might be near a market top. That doesn't mean you should sell everything in a panic, but it does mean you should reassess your risk tolerance and make sure your portfolio matches your timeline and needs. Consider holding more cash than you normally would. Cash feels bad when markets are going up, but it feels very good when everything else is going down and opportunities emerge. If you're thinking about making a major purchase, a house, a car, a business investment, ask yourself, can I still afford this if my income drops by 30% for a year? If the answer is no, reconsider the timing. The historical pattern. Here's something that should give you perspective. Every major recession follows the same pattern. First, the warning signs appear, but most people ignore them because things still feel okay on the surface. Then, there's a triggering event, a bank failure, a corporate bankruptcy, a geopolitical crisis that acts as the catalyst. The market drops sharply, everyone panics, and suddenly all the underlying problems that were ignored become impossible to ignore. The government and Federal Reserve scramble to respond, but the damage is already done. The recession is underway. Recovery eventually comes, but it's slow and uneven. Some people emerge stronger, many people take years to recover. We're currently in the warning signs that most people are ignoring phase. The question isn't whether the other phases will follow. History says they will. The question is what you're going to do at the time you have before the trigger event occurs. A contrarian take. Now, let me offer one contrarian perspective because intellectual honesty requires it. It's possible, not likely, but possible that we thread the needle, that the Fed manages a perfect soft landing, that commercial real estate stabilizes, that consumers stop spending just enough to bring down inflation, but not enough to trigger mass layoffs, that AI creates enough productivity gains to offset employment losses. It's possible that all 5 of these warning signs are just coincidental concerns that resolve themselves without triggering a broader crisis. But betting your financial future on that outcome is like seeing dark clouds, feeling the wind pick up, hearing thunder in the distance, and deciding not to seek shelter because it might not rain. Sure, maybe the storm will pass, but is that really the bet you want to make? The bottom line? The 2026 recession isn't a conspiracy theory. It's not financial doom porn designed to get clicks. It's a logical outcome of observable economic conditions that have preceded every major downturn in modern history. The yield curve is inverted, commercial real estate is collapsing, consumer debt is unsustainable, corporate layoffs are accelerating, savings are depleted. These aren't predictions. These are facts. These things are happening right now. What remains to be seen is the timing and severity. Will it be a mild recession that lasts 6 months, or a severe downturn that reshapes the economy for years? That depends on factors we can't predict: geopolitical events, policy responses, technological disruptions, and sometimes just luck. But what you can control is your preparation. You can reduce your debt, you can build your savings, you can secure your employment, you can adjust your investments, you can make smarter decisions about major purchases. When the recession comes in, based on everything we're seeing, it's coming. You'll be in the small percentage of people who saw it coming and took action. Everyone else will be asking, how did this happen? While you'll be asking, what opportunities does this create? Because here's the final truth. Recessions are terrible for people who are unprepared and transformative for people who are ready. The wealth gap doesn't widen during boom times, it widens during recessions, when unprepared people lose everything and prepared people buy assets at massive discounts. Which side of that divide do you want to be on? If this video gave you a different perspective on what's happening in the economy, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We're all in this together, but the people who prepare together come out ahead together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.